right, welcome back to the shop. Our shop cabinets are pretty much done. I got most all the tools put away, and then as I go along and clean up the last little bits of the shop and things and find tools that I forgot about, I'm just finding homes for them, making little tool holders and getting them put away here. So I'm pretty happy with how those turned out. So now it's time to move on to the next shop organization project. So let me show you what I got going on here. All right, so in this front corner of the shop, I have my lumber rack, and then I've been stacking sheet goods against the wall, but that has become a huge pain in the butt because the sheet good that I always want to use next eventually ends up to the back, and it's just a huge mess to try to get it all cleaned out. So I'm going to build a rolling cart that will stow away underneath the lumber rack. All right, so to build this, I have some poplar and alder. Alder is what I built the cabinets out of, so I want it to match. So this is going to be the majority of the part that you're going to see. But since this alder is a rustic grade alder, it's the cheapest thing my lumber yard has, it does have some knots in it, so I don't want to build the base out of it because it might not have as much structural integrity as I want it to. And the poplar has no knots, it's pretty clear, and it's just a step up in price from the knotty alder. So I'm going to build the base out of this. The base is going to be kind of a torsion box style, so that way it'll hold lots of weight and be able to roll around the shop, hopefully without collapsing on itself. So I'm going to get started milling this up, and then we'll get to the joinery. All right, so I'm ready to cut these pieces all to the same length. So of course I'm going to use a stop to increase my accuracy and speed. All right, so these long pieces are longer than the side wing of my table saw, so it's really hard to set up a stop for these long pieces at the table saw. So that's why I cut them on the miter saw. But the table saw is a lot more accurate than the miter saw. So for these smaller pieces, I'm going to switch to using the table saw, and I have my stop set up here, so these guys will also come out the exact same length. Cleaner cut, nice and accurate, and super fast compared to the miter saw. All right, so I have my longest rail here for the torsion box base, and I'm going to cut some half laps in it. So I have my fence set up to the left because they're so long that way I have the full support of the table. And I'm going to make a cut, and the way I planned it out is I can just turn it around and then make the other cut on the other end, and then any kind of discrepancy will end up in the middle. All right, so to cut the next joint, I'm out of room on this side of the table saw, so I'm going to move my fence back over to this side and hope that I have enough room to line this joint up without hitting the wall over there. I have two more in the center, and I'm going to use the fence again because my miter gauge isn't long enough to set a stop on there. Then once I finish cutting these guys, we'll do the same thing for these shorter cross pieces. All right, so to cut the half lap on the very ends of these guys, I have a sacrificial fence set up to protect my main fence, so that way the blade doesn't tear that up, and we'll just butt right up to it. And all right, so we got our half laps cut in here, so the grid's just going to go together just like this, and all the way down and all the way across. Now the real question is do I want to secure this together with just glue a brad nail, staple, or a screw. All right, fun fact, these two caps are interchangeable, which is very convenient for this next task. All right, I picked hardboard mainly because it was cheap and it has a nice smooth surface on one side, so that way when I slide my heavy sheets of plywood on there, it'll be easy to slide them in and out of the rack. And even though this is pretty thin, it's going to add a considerable amount of strength once this glue dries. So I've glued and stapled it down to the frame that we made, and then I'm going to take a router bit with a pattern tracing bit on it to just cut it out and trace around here to cut this excess off. All right, flip it over and skin the other side. All right, the base is done, and now it's time to build the dividers. And the dividers are going to be kind of like a picket fence system here. And just because I don't want to just staple them on there and staple this up here like this, because I don't think that looks very good, and it also takes up a lot of extra thickness here, I'm going to do half laps on these as well to connect all this together. So let's get started cutting some half laps. All right, so to cut the half laps on our divider rails, we're going to do the same thing as we did for the base. Cut it and then flip it around and then cut this other side and then work our way towards the middle. Now we do have a little bit different setup here for our half lap because it's going to take multiple passes to cut a half lap wide enough for this piece to go in. So let me show you this setup here. All right, so I've marked my layout lines here in Sharpie, so hopefully it'll show up better on camera. But what I have here is my stop block to the right side of my measurement, and that'll cut right up to that edge. And then to find this other measurement, I'm using my actual workpiece. This is going to be the vertical rail or vertical style, and I'm going to butt this up here. And before I cut it, I'm going to remove it. That way it doesn't get pinched in here, causing kickback. And then I'm going to cut the other one, which will cut to this side of the layout line, and then I'll work my way across between the two to cut the rest of it out. Now this stop block is the exact thickness of this dado blade, and that's important or this won't be a tight fit. If this stop block isn't the same thickness as the dado blade, it's going to be loose fitting. This stop block is counting for the thickness of the dado blade. If we didn't have that stop block in there, we would end up cutting one pass too wide. All right, so I don't think you can get that joint any tighter than that, so it's a really super nice tight fit. And once I cut the half lap on this side, that should slide down in here to where it's flush all the way across. So now I'm just going to do that for the rest of these guys and get her assembled. All right, so most of the dividers are narrow, about 2.5 inches or 2.25 inches, but the bottom divider is a little bit wider, and that's because it's going to act as the apron plus a stop to prevent things from sliding off the cart. So I have a much longer half lap to cut on the picket fence pieces. There is a little bit of a safety concern when cutting these guys. I am going to start cutting from the tip and then working my way multiple passes until I get to this end and butt up against my stop here on the fence. I don't want to start here and work my way out this way, because what will happen is once I remove all this material, it could cause a big problem for me here. A little safety concern, ruin my piece or my hands. All right, so I got all the half flaps cut, so it's time to do a little assembly, and I'm just going to keep this assembly really simple and just put a little glue in each one. And if this was a piece of furniture, I would clamp each joint tight and let it dry that way. But since this is shop furniture, all right, so to make sure my rail system stays square here and doesn't wiggle back and forth, I'm going to install one on this end, and then I'll work my way to the middle, and that way I can double check for square before I get too many of them laid down. All right, see how square we are. That's perfect. All right, so now that I know it's square, I'm just going to fill in the rest of them. All right, our cart is starting to take shape here. I got the long vertical dividers done, so now we're going to move on to building the end caps. All right, so I got my side pieces cut to width and length and milled up all nice and square. And so now I want to cut a little decorative angle on it just to dress it up a little bit, and also maybe help facilitate getting things in and out of the rack without having a sharp corner on the end. I think the track saw is going to be the best route. All right, so I have my top tier and lower tier, and these guys are going to get glued together just like this, and then this guy will get glued to the grid, and this guy will get glued to the lower grid, and then I'll glue them together after that assembly, because I think it's going to be way easier to assemble this to this than these guys and fight these guys. All right, so since this thing is so big, I'm going to glue it up into sub-assemblies. So I'm going to glue the sides first, and then I'll glue the little piece next. All right, so I got this sub-assembly glued up and drying, and so once it's dry, we'll glue it to the main top big sub-assembly, and then we'll do the other side. So I have a nice space here for scrap wood, another space here for scrap wood, and then between the two sides will be for sheet goods. Now I was gonna finish this before I assembled all of it, but I'm out of finish, and the Sherwin-Williams store here locally only stocks paint, so I have to go to Denver to get finished. So I'll finish this at a later date and just use it in its unfinished state. So while this is drying, I think we need to move on to getting casters on the base. All right, so I'm going to bolt these casters to this board and then screw this board to my base. So to give it a little meat on the end here, I'm going to hold it back about 1/4 inch. I'm going to eyeball center. And I'm going to countersink so the head of the bolt sits underneath the top of the wood here. And I'm going to pick a Forstner bit that is wide enough so I can get my socket in there. So I got this guy just a little bit wider. I'm going to countersink just enough for these bolts to go through. Use these neoprene washers just because I don't want to have to mess around with one ever coming loose. So this will kind of help lock it into place. All right, I wanted to put locking casters on both outside edges so I could lock both ends when I'm sliding big heavy sheet goods in, but the big box store only had one caster with a lock on it in stock. All right, so I'm flushing this up and I'm just going to use some 2-inch pocket hole screws to attach it. All right, I got the casters on there, and now it's time to install the dividers. So I'm going to take it off my bench, flip it over, and put it on the floor, because once I put those dividers on, I think it's going to be pretty heavy and hard to get off the bench. All right, the base is hardly flexing, so I think we did a good job building a strong base. Good design. So I am going to screw it in place, but just to get it lined up here, I think it's going to be a lot easier to get it in position and just tack it in place with a brad nail than try to hold it in place and screw it. So I'm just going to throw a couple brads in here while I get it in place. All right, so I'm going to apply some glue to the larger back subassembly. To add some strength and also give me some places to divide out and sort the wood, I'm going to mill down some wood and just screw it in place with some pocket hole screws. That should give this a lot more rigidity and help me keep this organized by having some divided space. All right, so instead of pocket hole screws, I decided I'm just going to tack it into place here. All right, so the plywood rack is done. I'm pretty happy with how that guy turned out. It's got lots of room for plywood there, a whole bunch of room from scrap wood and scrap plywood on both sides there. Now this guy is gonna go over here where my sanders are at. So the sanders are gonna get moved all the way over here. This rack right here, this pegboard garbage, is gonna end up in that corner. The lumber rack is going to go over here, and then all that plywood is going to go in the rack. Hopefully I can get all this scrap wood and plywood in the rack as well, and that will clean up a huge amount of the shop, and then I'll have this whole wall right here to buy more tools to hang there. All right, the cart is fully loaded. It has been in service for a couple of weeks now, so I think I can tell you what I think about my design and the good things and the bad things. So one good thing I like about my design is that the plywood is in the center. I've seen a lot of plywood cart designs where the plywood sits on the front edge and it leans back. The thing I don't like about that is that if you want the piece of plywood that's in the back, you have to fan all these other pieces out and try to shimmy out this really super heavy piece of plywood out from behind. So that's no better design than me leaning it up against the wall like the mess that I had before I built the cart. So with this design, all the plywood is in the center, and I can fold through it or flip through it like a book to decide what piece that I want to pull out. And I can either grab it by the top here and just slide it out because the top is open. There's no cover on it. And that's partly possible because of the torsion box bottom design that's not going to flex or sag, so I don't need any supports tying the two sides together. Now, alternatively, to get the plywood out, the cart's 7 feet long, not 8 feet, so there's always a few inches at the bottom that I can grab my fingers around without getting them pinched to the base to pull the plywood out. Now, loading the cart is really easy. I can open the door here, back my truck up to this door, roll the cart out, and then feed the sheets of plywood right into the center rack here, right from my truck. And then push it back, and it's all nicely stowed away. All right, so now even though I have the table saw and router table that's kind of in the way of the rack, it's really easy to get the plywood out just the same. Just swing it over, and then I can just slide the piece out that I want to work on, and I'm right here on the table saw to rip it to whatever width I need. All right, so now the aesthetics of the cart I really like as well. I love the grid work that I created across the front, but it's also functional. If a piece of wood falls down behind there, I can still see it through the grid work so I don't lose any pieces. All right, so this tube was just a happy accident. It just fit nicely in there. Some kind of shipping tube left over. Put all the little dowels and miscellaneous pieces that I wanted to save. So I'm going to do my best to keep this thing organized. So the one side has just a bunch of small little pieces of plywood cutoffs, and then the other side just has a whole bunch of scrap wood that I wanted to keep. Some of it is pretty expensive wood, like this piece of Paduke, I think that is, and some other exotic pieces in here. So really the only downside I have to say about the cart is I wish I would have been able to put 2 locking casters on there, but you know, what are you going to do when the home center's out of what you need? So hopefully I'll have a set of plans available by the time you're watching this. If not that day, hopefully very soon if you want to build this version for yourself. And thanks for watching. See you in the next video.